I learned a lot. And I learned that it makes a difference. This was the diving board area, and I was one of the guards, and they weren't allowed to, it was a 3-meter board. And if you fell off sideways, you landed on the darn cement over there. And Corn Pop was a bad dude, and he ran a bunch of bad boys. And I did, and back in those days, to show how things have changed, one of the things you had to use, if you used pomade in your hair, you had to wear a bathing cap.
All right, that is our president, Joseph Robinette Biden, in doing some classic Biden stuff, and sounded an awful lot like the power plant strike episode of The Simpsons, when Grandpa Simpson explains to Mr. Burns that he and his fellow strikebreakers can't bust heads like they used to, but they can tell people interminable stories, and he does the thing about the onion in his belt. That was the style at the time. It is almost dead on for that. But I will say that right now I am not entirely unhappy that Grandpa Biden is president, because it could be a whole hell of a lot worse in terms of the situation with Russia and Ukraine. Do we have the Biden tweet? All right, so he starts out like a Democrat by saying, I want to be clear. And then he says, we will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full might of a united and galvanized NATO. But we will not fight a war against Russia and Ukraine. A direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, and something we must strive to prevent. So, guys, the President of the United States says he's not going to do World War III. How would you expect people to react to this?
Good for you. Let's go, Brandon.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a relief for me to see, and I'd probably just keep scrolling, and my heart rate would go down a little bit, and I'd feel a little bit better. Then I wouldn't say anything probably.
Because you'd see all of the, and you'd expect that everybody would be very relieved, because World War III, follow me here, would be bad. I would not, in fact, like there to be a global thermonuclear exchange, which would end the possibility of organized human civilization and probably do many of us who survive to short, miserable lives. I'm against that. Apparently, Joe Biden is against it, and I hope he stays against it as this crisis goes on. But there seem to be a lot of people who don't share that hope. We've got a few disturbingly representative replies. I should say most of these are blue checkmark replies. I think the person that we've got who has the least followers on Twitter has like 50,000. Everything else is like hundreds of thousands. So this is not just like some random maniac, who has tweeted their thoughts at the president. This is representative of a good chunk of elite opinion in the United States. All right, so here we have Margaret Grubbs. President Biden, is America going to sit on our hands and watch as the world goes to World War III? You're dealing with a narcissist, Putin. He's just a little bully. It could have been handled with special ops like Saddam Hussein. I'm not sure I understand that part. You have to chop the head off the snake. And then she helpfully adds cliche and then frowny face. I'm not sure I understand that part about special ops.
I thought like they eventually just found Saddam Hussein hiding in a hole in the desert with a big thick beard.
Yeah, I mean, famously, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein wasn't really special ops so much as cluster bombing, invaded and occupied for the long term an entire country, having thousands of Americans die. Something like 600,000 and change excess deaths in the Lancet study within the first 2 years of the war. So that doesn't actually seem easy to me, but maybe there's something that we're supposed to have done that's equivalent. But okay, that was a little odd. Let's keep going. All right, this is David Schwartz. Says, if I were Putin, I would see this as a green light to do pretty much anything I want to do to any non-NATO country. Yeah, I mean, if we're not, if it's so. Just to be clear on what David Schwartz has objected to here, Joe Biden is not willing to go to war with another nuclear power unless it attacks us or a country that the United States is a military alliance with first. That's the crazy precedent he's establishing here.
That's what it seems like.
So I'm pretty sure this is not a new precedent. If you can think back to the history of the 20th century, there is kind of a reason why, the Soviet Union didn't send troops to fight against American troops in Korea or Vietnam, or there is a reason why the United States didn't send troops to fight the Red Army in Afghanistan. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why in 1999, when the United States was bombing the shit out of Serbia, which is a close Russian ally, Russia didn't intervene then, because generally speaking, there's precedent that you don't. I mean, again, if short of that terrifying exception, that they have that the other nuclear power attacks you or a country that you have a mutual defense treaty with. Other than that, you don't enter into wars with other nuclear powers. Seems like a pretty good principle to me.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who I guess think that the Cold War needed to be raised in temperature, right? That the Cold War wasn't fought hard enough. So they would have been definitely the hawks of the Cold War, from what I understand, right? They would have been clamoring for direct confrontation. Yeah,
I mean, they would have probably had the same position that a lot of the people around JFK had during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, come on, what are we doing? We got to bomb these airfields already. This makes us look weak. And, I'm personally, fairly grateful that none of those people's advice was taken, because that way I exist and I can do this show, and Twitter came into existence. So let's get another tweet. This one's my favorite. The 3-year letterman who has 350,000 or something Twitter followers. Apparently, he's a famous youth coach. Says we single-handedly won World War I and World War II. Joel.
It's the Joel that makes it, though.
Yeah. There's an impressive amount incorrect in such a short sentence. It's hard to get so much history wrong in so little characters and so few characters.
Yeah. Right. I mean, where do you start with that? Okay, so World War I and World War II was not, in fact, single-handedly. Neither of those were single-handedly won by the United States. There were a ton of countries in both of those, winning military alliances. In fact, in the case of World War II, quite a bit of the heavy lifting was being done by Russians. And it's not at all clear, that Hitler would have been defeated without that being part of it.
And also, Japan too. Let's not forget that. Like, Russia was actually, the Soviets were entering the north of Japan while we were nuking Japan.
Right. Yes, Lucas puts it succinctly. It was a world war involving the whole world. It's not like a World Series that we use the word world, but it's really just America. Like this was actually a world. Both of these were actually world things. So no, the United States did not do either one of those things single-handedly. Also, World War I and World War II were wars of the format where it's possible to win. That like you have one side that wins and the other side loses. I feel like these are just the most obvious cliches in the world, but apparently this has been widely forgotten since the end of the Cold War. World War III doesn't get a winner. That's not how World War III would work.
We need to bring back the TV miniseries, World War III. That taught Reagan a lesson. I think that's going to teach a new set of liberals a lesson.
Yeah, right. Again, go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy, who is not somebody I'm a big fan of for obvious leftist reasons, had given his response to the Cuban Revolution and his milquetoastness on civil rights and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in his famous address during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he pointed out that that victory in such a war would be ashes in our mouths, right? Which is which is a helpful way to put it. But I think we have a couple more of these. John Cipher, another blue check, says, "Stop saying that because it suggests we won't fight for anyone or anyone else. It puts a target on non-NATO countries. We fought for Kosovo and Kuwait in similar circumstances. What about Taiwan, Australia? What if Putin uses WMD in Ukraine?" Okay. So, Andy, you had a thought here?
Mostly it's like it seems that for the past 4 years, MSNBC has been beating this drum that Putin's crazy. And I don't think that Putin is necessarily crazy. I'm not going to say that he's like bastion of sanity because he's an egomaniac and that there are an autocrat and certainly not a nice guy all at all. But I don't think he's necessarily crazy. And I think that's the thing is that like what would he gain from using weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine? Like he wants that land, right? That's part of the reason why he's doing this. Is it's basically a buffer zone for that he can control more or less between him and NATO. If I understand the
I would assume that the plan is to have. I mean, you probably if the war is successful, whatever that ends up meaning, presumably, they'll probably like annex some more of the like Russian heavy bits and pieces. But I'd assume the plan is to have like a puppet government in Ukraine itself, and yeah, that would have that buffer zone role, which it's not at all clear.
And I think it's more like maybe not necessarily NATO is the first thing that he thinks of, but he wants to have like the same kind of power and influence that the Soviet Union once had.
Yeah, so I would just say, like, all right, let's just go all informal logic class on this, and when you're evaluated argument by analogy, right? What you look at are how strong are the analogies between these two, how strong are the relevant analogies between these things, and then how strong are the relevant disanalogies. Seems like a relevant disanalogy, even assuming, which of course I wouldn't, that the Gulf War, what's being referred to there with Kuwait and the 1999 intervention over Kosovo were justified, which, I was certainly very much against both of them and would be again. But forget that for a second. Seems like a relevant disanalogy might be that neither Iraq nor Serbia were nuclear powers. And you know why? Like, you know how I know that? Because the United States went to war with them. And neither Bush nor Clinton would have been insane enough to do that if it would have started World War III. All right. Is that it for the tweets, or do we have? All right, here we go. Alexander Vidman says, "Mr. President, you're inviting disaster and emboldening Putin. This declaration invites Putin to pursue every means to subdue Ukraine. Of course, the American people don't want war with Russia, but they also don't want to watch Ukrainians slaughtered. We must do more." I would just suggest that, given my understanding of how the world works, the end of the world would also be the end of Ukraine.
That's my understanding too.
Right. I mean, there's two options there, right? I mean, that we don't want a war with Russia, or the United States doesn't, and we also don't want to watch Ukraine suffer. So the solution is what? It's do more. What is what is more? Be better.
Yeah. I mean, my understanding too is Ukraine is like on the border with Russia, and nuclear fallout doesn't understand how borders work.
That's my understanding of Chernobyl, the TV miniseries. Speaking of different miniseries. But yeah, it seems like there's this kind of misunderstanding of like how Russia would receive our rhetoric, even in what they're saying, like, oh, they're going to take this as an open invitation. I mean, obviously we want to use rhetoric to cool down the situation, but it also just makes it seem like so simplistic that they're just going to take everything we say at face value anyway. You know what I mean? It just seems like much more simplistic than how I imagine these things actually go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing, right? Like, you imagine that, like, Vladimir Putin and his generals sitting around talking about, on the assumption that all of these people have, right? Like, their starting point that, I mean, look, is the war in Ukraine justified? Of course not. I think it's a terrible imperialist war. Was it a rational decision? To Andy's point, no, it was not at all a rational decision to invade Ukraine. It was a crazy escalation of the conflict, but it was also an escalation of the conflict that, already existed. I mean, the Ukraine had been in a civil war between pro-Russian and pro-Western factions for 8 years before that happened. This wasn't just that Putin woke up one day and decided to embark on a Napoleonic, program of world conquest. But let's say he had, right? That was actually what happened. These guys are imagining Putin and his generals sitting around, and it's like, oh, after this, you're going to invade Poland? What, Germany? Oh, no, fuck, that's right. The United States will probably go to war, right? No, Mr. President, I saw a tweet from Joe Biden. He says he doesn't want to do World War III. Go nuts!
Yeah, like the alternative would be Joe Biden saying, like, just so you know, all of you oligarchs in Russia, like, I'm going to go World War III on your ass if you if you expand your borders. And they're like, oh, okay, we gotta.
That would all things right down. All right. Well, we've got a lot coming up. I should say, while we're still talking about, exactly, the Einstein quote about how World War III will be fought. World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So before we entirely leave World War III behind, I do want to just say that for GTAA patrons in the post game, we are going to be doing a follow-up of sorts to the debate breakdown that we did last week, which was actually about whether the invasion of Ukraine was justified. And when I saw who it was on Modern Day Debate, I kind of knew it was going to be a ridiculous shit show that nobody would learn anything from. But I was just so fascinated to see what the yes people were going to say, like what they were going to come up with to see why the invasion of Ukraine was justified, that I watched anyway. So it was two people who were yes, pro invasion of Ukraine, were a gentleman called Haas, also known as Infrared, and also Jackson Hinkle. And then the opponents were the gentleman known as Destiny, Steven Bannon, I believe is his Christian name, and Dylan Burns. And I want to just play, if we've got this, Jake, a little clip to give you a flavor of what that debate ended up being like that we watched last week.
Just for a second. Okay, so I do want to I want to go back to Dylan. We'll give him a chance, and then we'll give you a chance to answer the question. Jackson, Infra, I've got...
They had already declared independence.
I was just to say, I've got you on mute.
Okay.
Give me a break here.
So the reason why Jackson isn't answering my question is because the two options, neither of them was joining back with Ukraine. So there
because they already chose not to do that.
Shut up, please. Jesus Christ. So the reason why a lot of people, including like Crimean Tatars and others, boycotted.
They already declared independence.
Jeez Louise.
The reason why. The reason why
they had already declared independence before.
James, I can't do it, man.
You can't because you're They declared independence before nations came. They rejected government.
He's muting himself. All right.
So that would be Haas repeatedly unmuting himself. I'm not quite sure which streaming software they were using or how that was possible. I'd like to think it's just the sheer psychic force of his rage.
Yes.
undoing the host duty over and over again. But several people told us that, we always skip the Q&A when we do these things. It takes long enough without it. But several people told us that no, you can't skip the Q&A. The Q&A is where it gets really crazy. And so, okay, all right, that sounds like a post-game activity to me. So the post-game for patrons, we will watch the Q&A for this debate. We have both of the people who did the breakdown with me last Thursday, Victor Bruzzone and Ethan, better known as Mouthy Infidel, or I guess he renamed his YouTube channel Electrons and Love. But those two are going to be joining us in the post-game to watch the Q&A. So if you are not already a Give Them an Argument patron, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. Sign up now and watch that as soon as we're done with the main show, and also get every single other patron exclusive post game that we always do after the episodes on Monday night, as well as various other benefits. So go do that. But meanwhile, before we have our main guest on, so our main guest is going to be Benjamin Teitelbaum, who's going to talk to us about Steven Bannon. I'm looking forward to that conversation. That should be a lot of fun. But before that, I wanted to play something else, which happened on the Callin show. So people may remember for the last couple of months, I've been doing the show on the Callin app, Callin, which was originally something you could only do on your iPhone, and now it's Android, and apparently and there's like a listen-only option. You have to be on your phone to call in, but there's like a listen-only option on the browser. And now I think they're just rolling out, actually syndicated it to like RSS feeds for Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But 99.999% of the time when people call into this thing, they genuinely want to have a conversation or get information. But every once in a while, there's a different sort of call. And in one of the episodes that we did last week, our good friend Ryan Lake was on, and there was a sort of impromptu mini debate that I wasn't expecting, particularly about the topic I wasn't expecting. And I just thought we could play some of that right now. All right. Masha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So since it's International Women's Day, my question is, what is a woman?
What is a woman? I've got an answer to that. I don't know if you want to go first, Ryan, or
you go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it depends on the context. I think that an analogy I find really helpful is from Sophie Grace Chappelle, who says that who analogizes words like man and woman, these gender words, to parent. That there are a couple of different definitions you could use of parent, and in most cases they coincide, so we don't need to worry too much about how to sort them out. So, there's a clear biological definition of parent, and but there's also like a social or legal one that, so by the social or legal one, right? If you could be a step parent, you could be an adoptive parent, and in all of these contexts, we have no problem using words like mother and father for somebody, even though they don't fit the biological definition. And I think something similar is probably true about gender, that there's that there are like this sort of adult human female or adult human male definitions of man and woman. That is clearly one thing that that's clearly one way of using these words, and one that's appropriate for some context. If you're talking about women's health, for example, that might be a relevant one. Just like if you're talking, but the same way if you're talking about, if you're talking about the test came back and you're not the father, right? We know what the word father means there. But if it's the report, let's make sure we send the report card to the child's father, right? The term means something else there. and we would think that somebody who didn't want to apply it in context like the second one to stepfathers or adoptive fathers, because that doesn't count. I think we wouldn't we wouldn't think much of that person. I think we'd probably be right, and I think something roughly similar is true here. That there's sort of package of things about how people present themselves, how they think about themselves, how other people think about them, whether their participation in certain sorts of gender segregated activities, how they're designated in different cultural or legal ways.
Can you give me an example of a gender segregated activity rather than a sex segregated activity?
Well, I mean, I think part of the problem is that generally activities that are gender / segregated, sex segregated, I think it's contested, right? Which of those it is. Like
Is
a lot.
it?
I think so. I mean, it's so like an obvious example is bathrooms, right? So bathroom says women's room or men's room on it, but whether but nobody ever really bothered particularly to differentiate whether that meant man or woman in the sense of gender identity, whether that meant man or woman in the sense of biological sex at birth, until relatively recently. In most cases it coincides, and it wasn't really that politicized as an issue, so the sort of contestation didn't come up, whereas in the last few years that's been super duper contested, right? There are laws that were passed in various states saying that it's this is that means sex rather than gender. There are many people who vigorously disagree with those laws. So I think in a lot of cases, whether something that's sex / gender segregated, which of those is the thing that it should be. I mean, we could disagree about what the right answer is for this case, but a lot of that stuff is pretty contested, I think.
Mm-hmm. Then you also talk about a social or legal definition of each. So can you give me an example of like a social or legal definition of woman, right? Like that doesn't rely on biology and that also doesn't rely on like sex stereotypes or misogynistic tropes about makeup, hair, presentation, sexual availability, duty to care for others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the simplest one, which I suspect you're not going to like, but I mean, the simplest one is just identification, right? Like how somebody would identify themselves, or or how others would identify them. I mean, that is, whether that's the one that should be most relevant is obviously going to be hugely controversial, but I mean, that does seem like something that doesn't check any of your boxes just now.
Right. I mean, yeah, obviously that's not. Also, as like people with like philosophy and potentially history backgrounds, I was hoping for a more logical answer.
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean by logical in that case, right? I mean, like if you mean internally consistent, then I mean, what's the internal inconsistency you see there?
That like if anyone that says that they're a woman is a woman, then what is a woman? What does it mean to feel like a woman or to perceive oneself as a woman? Right? Like that's completely circular because, right? Like what other category is so porous, so undefined that one can be simultaneously in it and not in it, and also gatekeep around it but not be in it? Like those are not, you know what I mean? Those are like fairly unprecedented like social phenomenon.
Yeah, I wonder about that. If that is the only case where we'd say that that whether somebody thinks of themselves as being that thing is all that's really relevant for their designation as that thing, right? So I think that I think that at least in certain contexts, being a Christian is probably like that. Of course, there are theological definitions of which things to believe a Christian, but those are all going to be
about being Black.
Those are all going to be hotly contested. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously that one's not going to be any less controversial than this one. And I don't think I actually think that one's going to be. I think that one's actually probably going to be an interesting case for your view because it doesn't really seem like, at least in the sex case, there seems like a relatively straightforward. I mean, there are ambiguous cases and there are things that make it less straightforward, but I mean, it's going to be at least a relatively straightforward distinction. Whereas in the case of race, I mean, what's the biological definition? It doesn't really seem like there is one.
Yep.
So, so I think that in the case of being black or white or anything like that, I mean, I think that the how you think of yourself, how others think of you, you know, I mean, I think unless we're just going to stop using those words, is probably going to be it. Again, I think that there are probably, whether you're designated in some, you know, bureaucratic context, you know, like where they want to know people's religion, you know, whether you're thought of as a Christian. I mean, that's not going to be based on any sort of contested theological definition. That's going to be based on, you know, how you think of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So is that circular? I'm not sure it is. I certainly don't think it's internally inconsistent. I mean, it might just be wrong to you, right?
Like if it has no borders, right? If it has literally no, then what is the purpose of that container, right? Then it means everything and nothing. And it also, as materialists, right? Like if we're leftists, we have to at some point like admit to being some form of materialist, yes? So that means that there's no sex class, right? There's no common cause to be had among biological females that are women, right? Like there's a lot of implications for that leftists, well, Americans who identify as progressive leftists really don't want to grapple with, or decided they don't give a shit.
Well, maybe. I think that I would resist the leap from saying that there are going to be biological and non-biological ways of using some of these terms, to saying that it can't be true that there are interests that everybody who fits the biological definition might have in common, right? I mean, that there might be, you know, like in the parent case, there might be certain rights that you should have by virtue of being a biological parent, right? You know, that might reasonably come with, you know, with certain rights.
No, if a whole like a whole class of humans, which comprise roughly half the planet, are not allowed to talk about being oppressed on the basis of their reproductive physiology or their biological reality, like take FGM, for example, fetal genital mutilation, right? There have been in the space very recently huge, hot, like, screaming messes about that term being transphobic. Right.
Yeah. So I think I would make a distinction. I think we probably, for the sake of analytical clarity, we're going to have to make a distinction between whether or not it does make sense to think of gender identity as one way to use these terms, or whether there are reasons why it might be morally appropriate to use that term in this way in some context. And like every single thing that anybody anywhere in the world might say on the basis of that, right? That they have because if the only contention is that there are people who make unreasonable claims, like, you know, it's transphobic to use the phrase female genital mutilation, then I can agree with you, that is unreasonable. But I would resist the step backwards from saying that that's an unreasonable thing to object to saying that, like, therefore we should just never use gender terms to refer to gender identity rather than biological sex. Or
where's Ryan?
We never use those terms to mean anything other than biological sex. I mean, I think those aren't the only options.
Well, I think another option is to say that trans women are trans women, right? Like, why do we need to make space, like, in an inclusive way?
Yeah, he comes in
an embattled community when things are very much backsliding for us globally. Why is it that usually quite entitled, male-bodied people who experienced much of their life as men with all of the attendant privileges, right? How is it that now our entire movement is about them, including like dyke marches and you know, all kind of the pussy hat thing. Like I didn't agree with it. I hate that as a symbol, but the fact that that was transphobic and women were prevented from identifying with that, etc. Like those are hugely problematic things from within our community. So, right, if we can't as leftists organize around things that are material reality, what the fuck is our community about?
Yeah, so I guess to me it sounds like those are, I mean, I think that there's, again, I'd want to make a distinction between saying, like, is it actually true that the only way, and you said it's logical earlier, or, the only way that, conforms to material reality to use these terms is always in every context to use them to mean sex rather than gender identity, which again I just don't think is true. I mean, I don't think it's unmaterialist to use the word parent in ways other than for refer to biological parentage either. But I think we could make a distinction between that and saying that, like, every single claim that anybody ever makes on the basis of that is correct. That, like, therefore, it's transphobic to use the phrase women's health, or it's transphobic to use the pussy hats as a piece of protest symbolism, right? Like, I think that you can, I mean, by very, very rough analogy, I think anti-Semitism is a real and disturbing thing in the world. But there are many, many things I've heard people call anti-Semitic where I think they're just being ridiculous, and it's not actually anti-Semitic. I mean, we all know how to make those distinctions. I think we should make them here. I mean, I think really it sounds like your issue is more this sort of moral or political issue about how to think about trans people and oppression that trans people have faced, and whether it's the same or different.
Not really. I mean, I'm not at all preoccupied by that. I stay in my lane. I organize around the the issues that I face as a member of my class, including my sex class, which is biological females, right? And for me, a woman, because I'm not from North America, I was born in the Balkans, came here as a refugee from Civil War, so we know what we're talking about. When we say women, we mean adult human females who survived their girlhood. Like, that's what we fucking mean. And if you don't share that experience of surviving girlhood, probably we can't really organize along the same lines. Now, trans rights are human rights. I'm totally going to be on it if there's an issue regarding that. But inclusion in spaces that have been built for generations by women struggling against every form of obstacle, not really. I mean, build your own organizations and support networks and funding drives and whatever else, right?
So how about the issue? So how about things that aren't built by a movement, but are just things that already generally exist in society, like I mean, it's like the bathroom issue that was mentioned earlier, for example. What's your stance on that?
I have two minds about that. Like, in the West, I think it's obvious that for trans women who pass and who are there literally to just use the bathroom, like, absolutely, that makes sense. Like, if you're able to go about your daily life and nobody's gonna bat an eyelash, great, do it that way. Now, I know factually that's not the only way that kind of inclusion gets used. So I would like to see someone on, like, on the level of any leftist male activist, come and get your boys, come and get your autogynophile, like, dudes, come and get these like weirdos that go in the women's bathrooms because of self-ID laws. They can, with full beards and smearing their semen, for example, on the toilet paper roll. Like, this is shit that really happens, that gets posted to social media as like a form of engagement with feminists, with TERFs.
I just think broadly we want to be very careful about using those kinds of examples to characterize entire movements or characterize groups of people. And And also,
I didn't. I think that there's two very separate communities.
Well, that's what I mean.
Under that umbrella.
I don't even want to draw the conclusion they're entire communities of people based on these incidents you see on social media, and also just to characterize movements based on the kinds of debates that happen on social media.
Did you hear me do that? I absolutely did not.
I don't know if you're doing that or not. I'm just suggesting it's just as a rule of thumb. Like, we don't want to.
Also, do you know where that phrase comes from?
Yes, I do.
So maybe don't fucking use that. Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Like basic leftist thing. Like, let's not use language that was totally invented, literally beat women down. How about that on International Women's Day? And Brian, why don't you answer my question? What is a woman?
I basically co-sign with what Ben said initially. I think there are different contexts in which the word woman is going to have different meanings and purposes, and for the most part, these overlap. But back to my point about social media, I just think we want to be careful to draw conclusions about what the trans community is like based on particular debates that might get a lot of attention on social media. We have to remember that the percentage.
I'm not saying those are trans women. I specifically said that there are people that will make use of those laws that probably in their everyday life in no way are legitimately part of that community. That's my issue with self-ID. That's my issue with that whole, like, anyone who says they're a woman is a woman, right? That also, like, completely puts our, like, trans siblings in danger, actually.
No, what I was trying to speak to was certain debates that you were referring to that get a lot of traction on social media, like whether female genital mutilation is a transphobic term. And these kinds of debates might get a lot of traction on social media, but we have to remember that it's something like 5 to 10% of people who are active on social media who are driving 95% of the discourse. It's only a small percentage of society as a whole is even on social media at all. So I would just also urge caution generally in drawing conclusions about what's animating.
Okay, so you're going to tone police me and like kind of message police me, but not answer the question of what is a woman.
I'm in no way policing your tone. I'm saying we have to be careful about how we characterize a group based on what's happening on social media.
I was, and I did, and I am. Thanks.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
All right. It did actually last for about 30 seconds longer than that. She just started looping back and repeating herself. We finally ended the call. But I want to throw to you guys for your thoughts about that. But my initial thought was I knew what she was saying with the rule of thumb thing, but I was like 99% sure that was bullshit. And I did in fact look this up later. There's an article from 1998 that was William Safire was debunking this. I think we have the graphic of that from the New York Times, and it's something that's popped up periodically since then. There's there we go. This rule of thumb, William Safire, January 25th, 1998. So check that out for anybody who's curious about that. The urban legend is that rule of thumb comes from like a 19th century judge saying you could beat your wife with something that wasn't thicker, like a stick that wasn't thicker than a thumb. It is complete nonsense. The phrase rule of thumb was being used in the 1600s to mean exactly what it means today. Like, you're measuring something like with the thumb, not like a precise measurement, right? You're speaking, approximately. But in any case, that little linguistic digression aside, I will say when it got to that, I knew that things had reached the point where probably it was not going to be productive anymore.
Yeah, I like the fact that she's accusing other people of tone policing when she's like seemingly tone policing both you and Ryan.
Yeah, the thing about tone policing was an awkward fit with the how dare you fucking use the term rule of thumb, this horrible offensive term that that it's not like everybody uses like extremely common normal phrase that even if it did originate, she thinks it did not, right? Like, that's not what anybody has meant by it, even in that world, right? For a very, 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 very long time. So yeah, I don't know. It just seemed to me like I was. Yes, Jeb says Ben discriminating against thumbless people, but I don't. I guess the thing that did seem telling to me about that is that she asked a question, and I mean, the second that like the sentence was out of her mouth, it's like, oh god damn it, okay, well, I guess we're going to do this, right? So she asked the question, I gave an answer. She obviously didn't agree with the answer, right? But I never quite got like, there was this idea that it's illogical somehow to answer that way. I never got what the inconsistency is supposed to be. It just seemed like I don't know. I mean, like, again, I've been very lucky. There have been like 2 calls like this. The other one was somebody who wanted to let me and Branko Marketic know that we were Putin apologists. But like, other than this is not normally how people interact with it. But that was just a very, very strange little mini debate that happened there.
Yeah, I mean, I actually am going to stay a little bit in my lane and not try to proclaim to be an expert on this, but I do find the psychology of her alienating in 2 respects. One, I guess it was kind of illuminating to hear TERF speak for, if I could call her that, speak for such a long time, because it's very hard for me to understand the like emotional motivation behind that, I guess, other than just some kind of classic conservative viewpoint. But then the second is like, why is it like I need to go on Ben Burgis's Callin show and just like nail him on this? It's like, it was a strange choice, but it all led to that. So
yeah,
I mean,
I actually think, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect this was actually probably fallout from the Rogan appearance, because there was a little bit of trans talk in the Rogan episode, and it's funny because whatever, I think like there is some evidence that the vast majority of leftists who listened to that liked it. As gross as I feel using this as a metric of anything on my tweets about it when we showed, but like, out of people who were upset about it, I think some of them who were upset about those parts didn't like the fact that I just sort of like calmly told him what I thought and why I disagreed with him, instead of like yelling at him and calling him names. And also I didn't pretend to have like medical expertise that I obviously don't have about like exactly what the clinical standards should be for going on puberty blockers, or exactly what the a reasonable standard would be for hormone requirements for sports participation. But
even though you're a doctor,
I am a doctor, but I'm that's doctor philosophy. So that's just the kind of doctor who's qualified to tell a dying person that death is inevitable, it defines life, and and all that stuff, not to actually save their life. I guess, but I think again, I don't know. I suspect this came out of the Rogan interview, because there's a different group of people, right? There were actually a bunch of these in YouTube comments who were upset about the trans parts of that interview for the opposite reason, which is that no matter how nice I was being about it, they did pick up on what my position was, and they didn't like that, right? And I think this woman was one of them, and she, I guess, wanted to call up and demand to know why I don't think what she thinks, and proceeded to get very upset about it.
Well, she's just a class reductionist, reduce everything to the sex class. That sex class. This is not another one of those class reductionists.
That is such an interesting words, sex class. I mean, I guess if you just literally be a class like category, then anything could be a class. But I'm not sure how relevant all of them are, in most contexts. And of course, also, I mean, a lot of my disagreement with this stuff is just that it's kind of, a lot of it's just sort of classic, like identity politics stuff. I mean, even apart from the trans-exclusionary that we, there's sort of like, you can have movement only for people who, who meet certain, identity criteria and whatnot, which always just seemed kind of dumb to me. That like, I sort of think that if people want to have associate together for the sake of, doing group therapy or stuff like that. That's one thing, you share the same experience of surviving girlhood. But if you actually have a political movement to try to achieve things in the real world, it seems to me that the more people that you have in it, the better off you are. As a general rule, that my understanding of how politics works is that stuff that has the support and participation of more people is more likely to happen than stuff that has the support and participation of fewer people. Also, lots and lots of categories have amorphous borders and have contested borders. Look at the debates the Knesset has once every 2.5 years about what is a Jew. Look at there are a zillion examples like this. Are you only really a black person if you're an African descendant of slaves? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, by the way, I still think that a religious analogy was pretty good, because I think a religious discrimination lawsuit, like the fact somebody considers themselves to be a Christian, would probably be what would be more important than than whether or not they adhere to some theological dogma that that makes them a Christian according to some more substantive views. I think actually a lot of things are based on self-reporting. Anyway, enough of that. We're going to switch gears and talk about instead of talking about a mildly acerbic person who probably starts out with a lot of lefty premises that I do, but has a sharp turn on this one issue. We're going to switch to a total sweetheart of a person and talk about Steve Bannon. So I will see you guys later. I am now joined by Benjamin Teitelbaum, who is the author of a book called War for Eternity. How are you doing, Steve? Benjamin?
I'm doing well, Ben. I feel like I'm not going to live up to that that level of tension with the recording you just played for us. And I should warn you, my voice is kind of giving out on me right now, but hopefully you can hear me.
Okay. Well, with any luck, we'll last through the interview. So,
boy, I was listening to the whole thing. I didn't actually know. I come into the waiting room here and not having the context is like, am I going to speak to this person too? Am I going to be is my language going to be parsed? I better watch out here. I don't know what sort of context. So, I felt good when I heard the recording turn off and I realized what was going on. So,
yeah, fair enough. We are going to disagree a little bit, not as much as that, but a little bit. But first. Well, let's do it this way, right? So I think that think about Steve Bannon. I think he's somebody who a lot of people find sort of fascinated in a not great way. I think, for example, I don't know if we have these, Jake, but of a bunch of headlines that The Onion did about him. During the early Trump administration, for example, nervous Steve Bannon binge eats entire class of interns amid calls for removal. What's the next one we got here? Steve Bannon's liver pulsed visibly through shirt during strategy meeting. Steve Bannon mixes discarding climate change report with saliva to build final wall of nest. And he's fascinating. He seems like a strange guy who fascinates a lot of people.
So all those things about Mark Meadows, right?
Yeah, you really can't imagine the Mark Meadows tweets that are quite. They Mark Meadows Onion articles that are quite like that. Yes. But before we kind of get to how you see Bannon and how. I mean, the idea for doing this episode came up in the first place, because we were disagreeing a little bit on Twitter about how to see this. But tell me a little bit about the book and how you decided to write this.
So Bannon in 2017, or when would this have been? No, this would have been late 2016. let slip in a speech that he knew about Alexander Dugin and he knew about Julius Evola. And they're two thinkers who, are broadly categorized within an ideological territory, let's say, called traditionalism within the far right. And to me, I was interested in that. I'm a scholar of the far right, the radical right, whatever we would call it, neo-fascism. It was remarkable to me just because a lot of the contemporary followers of those thinkers were nowhere near places of influence. They were sometimes formally people who disavowed activism and said that they wanted no part in politics. They didn't believe in politics. So I thought that was interesting. And I tried for a long time to get in touch with him because I was curious to learn more about his ideological background, and saw in Josh Green's book about Bannon, Devil's Advocate, or Devil's Bargain, excuse me. Sorry, Josh, if you're watching. He not only found out that Bannon knew about Julius Evola, but also René Gonon, which is a far more difficult esoteric thinker within that ideological territory of traditionalism. And that suggested to me that, wow, okay, Bannon actually, this wasn't that he just kind of heard an offensive name mentioned and wanted to throw it out to offend people, but he actually might have been something of a committed ideologue in this particular way. And so it took a year for me after that to then finally get in touch with him. But when I did, he had already been kicked out of the White House. He was really kind of out in the wilderness. There was a lot of conversation about him being irrelevant. Let's stop talking about Steve Bannon, which was a perfect time for me, a professor, to swoop in and get a lot of his time. And I spent, it was about a year and a half interviewing him, following him very closely. And during that time, I not only learned about his background, but I also watched him interacting with other figures in very similar positions throughout the world. One of them being Alexander Dugin, and the other one being Olavo de Carvalho, who was the late guru of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Both of those two figures also with a background in this particular ideological school. So that's what the book is about: is me figuring out, how did Steve get interested in this? What does he think in particular? How does it animate his understanding of politics? And then also, what were these people actually doing during the years I was following them?
Yeah. Okay, so that's really interesting. So the way all of this came up in the first place is that I think on Twitter I was pursuing a pretty common theme of mine in the last couple of years, which is that people who are branded as right-wing populists are not actually fundamentally different than like classical Reaganite Republicans. That like all of these people who will sort of throw around this language, don't actually they'll like not really translate it too much in practice. So you have I was arguing with Charlie Kirk. This was a big thing that he's gone along with this like so many other people, and so he'll call himself a populist, but man doesn't even want to raise the minimum wage. It's ridiculous. And so I was definitely throwing Bannon into that, and I guess I'll just say a little bit of what that's based on from my perspective, which is I remember watching in so I think this was like 2019, possibly very early 2020. There's something called the Mouthy Debates in Toronto, which is this very like kind of, it's like the prestige TV of political debates. And Bannon did one then with David Frum, and yeah, you see that. So and I watched it, and I've got to say, maybe you had a different takeaway than I did, but I mean, mine was like spent an hour and a half, however long, with like throwing rhetoric at Bannon, sort of vaguely insinuating that he's a fascist, and Bannon throwing rhetoric at Frum to about like sort of salt of the earth working class deplorables. And one thing that they never actually really did is disagree about policy. well, sure. I mean, they're both Republicans, right? I mean, they probably don't really disagree with about that much of policy. And then after that, like a few months after, Bannon was on the podcast Red Scare, and I thought that was really interesting because it was not an unfriendly interview. The Red Scare girls were, friendly and flirty and all that stuff, right? And Bannon kind of blathered on about the fourth turning and all that stuff that sort of registered to me as pretentious horseshit. And then they asked him, like the host asked him, what seems like a simple question: if you're such a populist, why don't you support Medicare for all? And he sort of goes around in circles, and he can't quite figure out what to say about that. And so my takeaway from all of that is, oh, look, this is, Ozzy Osbourne is not innately edgier than Robert Plant, but he had the Prince of Darkness branded, like this is just this Republican who said, whatever, it's bad enough, right? To be a Republican, but this is just a Republican who's picked up some right-wing intellectual interests, and has this kind of edgy branding, but he's not really fundamentally, really when it gets down to it, if he'd gotten all the stuff he was advocating in the Trump White House, other than maybe trying harder on the Muslim ban than Trump did, what that would have mostly meant, certainly his economic program was like, raising the top marginal tax rate to like a little bit closer to what it was in the 1990s, and like using some of it on infrastructure. It just didn't seem like much to write home about. But I know that your view is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your view is that Bannon represents something that is actually maybe qualitatively different from what somebody like David Frum represents, and much more insidious.
Yes. I was kind of waiting for that final point, because I'm not that invested in saying whether or not he's a true populist, and I'm not sure what that would mean. Yes, it's interesting you bring up those two moments. I mean, on Red Scare, he did surprisingly say we need some sort of universal coverage. I'm not okay with healthcare being something that is unevenly, or I shouldn't put those words in his mouth, but that's, that there would be people in our society who do not have any health insurance or access to healthcare. He did say that. I feel like
he kind of sounded like Pete Buttigieg or somebody. It's like, well, I don't want Medicare for all, but we should have more access.
Yeah. I mean, but for I'm old enough. I feel like that's I'm still surprised if I hear a Republican say that. So that's something. For him, border controls, tariffs on trade, that's his populism, and that's his affront to the status quo or the establishment is a sort of global borderless capitalism. So I would say that, but yes, to the bigger point that you got at the end there, Ben, if you look at his life, Ben Shapiro, I really would love to see the two of you speak. I think he's read my book. He makes a compelling case when he looks back through Steve's Bannon life and said, this guy's a dilettante, right? Mm-hmm. He jumps from person to person, to project. He leeches onto people, and when they fall, he throws them away. And we can see that, the Duck Dynasty people, Sarah Palin, people when he was at Goldman Sachs, and probably eventually Donald Trump as well. But the one thing that has been fairly consistent in his life has been an interest, in what we might call alternative spirituality, for lack of a better term, the stuff at the New Age bookstore, the metaphysical bookstore, and be a sort of formal anti-modernism, which would just weird a lot of the people, a lot of, like, let's say, the Republicans out. I think if Lindsey Graham knew about the stuff that Bannon was into, I think he'd be totally. And indeed, when Jared Kushner, if we are to believe Michael Wolff, when Jared Kushner got a little glimpse of some of the stuff in the White House, he was horrified, and that was one of the final straws. That's when they started. This guy needs to get out of here. He needs to get out of here.
Okay, so you want to spell this out a little bit, the alternative spirituality interest?
Sure. So it began with transcendental meditation, as it did for lots of young white men in America in the 70s, in the early 70s. It eventually works its way, though, into this stuff called capital T traditionalism, which I was referring to earlier, and that's what my ultimate interest was. It is not initially a political school. It's a philosophical or religious school that believes once upon a time there was like a complete, true, accurate religion that got it all right. The tradition, capital T. And that as time went on, it was forgotten. Its truths were scattered around the world. It only exists in piecemeal fashion. You can find it in the esoteric branches of a lot of world religions. Sufism, esoteric Christianity, some branches of Catholicism, Orthodoxy, but especially Hinduism.
Okay.
And Hinduism is approved because of its antiquity in this case. The older and the more integral a tradition has been, the more likely it is to have preserved the old truth. What matters for politics, what matters for Bannon, are a couple of things that they think were contained in that religion. Two that I tend to highlight if I don't have a ton of time. One of them is cyclic time. And this will be familiar to anyone who studied Hinduism, but a belief that instead of history proceeding in linear fashion, we are cycling through ages, specifically 4 ages: a golden, which proceeds to a silver, to a bronze, to a dark, and after a cataclysmic event, back to a golden, and you start over again. The consequences of that they might be for politics, I imagine a lot of your listeners can follow right now. One of them is that, or can anticipate, excuse me. One of them is that as time moves forward for virtually all of our existence, things are getting worse. Big picture. If we know that golden is better than dark. The other thing is that we never really escape what we were. Your archaic identity is what you are destined to become. You're never really going to escape some pre-existing essence or identity that you once were. And the best that you could ever hope to achieve in this world, the best society we could ever dream about, is something that has already been in the past, very formally. You might see this as being implicit in some kind of casual, informal conservatism, but it's sharpened and gnarled in this case. The other thing, aside from cyclic time, is a belief that cyclic time interacts with a caste hierarchy. And if this would be familiar to, again, to anyone who knows a bit about Hinduism, a caste hierarchy, picture a pyramid. At the top, you have Brahmins. You move down to a warrior caste, to a merchant caste, and to a slave caste. The Brahmins are priests, and that hierarchy has a sort of it celebrates spirituality opposite materialism. Mm-hmm. For a lot of traditionalists, they said, well, guess what else is built into this hierarchy? The Brahmin castes are Aryans, mm-hmm. and the lower castes are non-Aryans, and you fuse that with some kind of modern 19th century European understandings of Aryanism and race, and then it becomes more racialized in the way that we think about race today. They also say that the Brahmins are more masculine, or masculinist, I think you should say, in their disposition, opposite of more feminine. Undercaste, that the upper castes are oriented or come from the north, and tend to worship the sun and look to the sky, whereas the lower castes do not. They come from the global south and they worship the ground. So these are the sort of oppositions. This is what makes an era gold and versus dark. And they believe that as that time cycle moves forward, that the hierarchy, as we move toward a dark age, the hierarchy crumbles essentially, and you lose spiritual values, you lose priests, you lose pure Aryans, and eventually you end up in a dark age where everyone is at the level of a slave, and materialistic values prevail. And also the fact that hierarchy is gone is a token of the fact that borders and boundaries between all types of peoples in any way you could think of are gone. And we find ourselves in a society that's committed to quantity over quality, that is borderless, where politics are going to be based either on democracy or communism, both of them kind of being materialistic and based in quantities. And that Aryans will be gone. So that's kind of raw Evolian traditionalism there. And it's a way to look at our era and say, okay, globalization, feminism, multiculturalism, multi-ethnic democracy, is communism a fight between only these, the communistic East and the capitalistic West? That's all that we have to choose between. This is obviously the dark age. And the way to get out of that is to typically proceed through a dark age into a golden. So I'll stop. I'm talking a lot here, Ben, but hopefully this.
No, I'm not interrupting you because this is all really interesting. So I think, so I'm not sure how close it ties in I do want to get to them before we go too much further. You sent me a couple of audio clips of I believe from your discussions with Bannon. Jake, do we have those right now?
Yeah. If they said if they knew I had a meeting with Dugan, literally it'd be front page of the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Is that Bannon's a traitor? And they'd go nuts. And here's why: is that and they are kleptocrats. I understand the corruption and everything like that, and they're bad guys. But the central thing is that Dugan and Putin and these guys are nationalists. They're Russian nationalists.
Yeah.
And they believe in the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
And they want to see uniting, and that has driven the globalists absolutely fucking nuts.
No.
They've lost their shit, right?
And do you think that you can could envision a world where we coexist with them, where they are
not coexist? They're going to be an ally. Not coexist. They have to be an ally.
Yeah, against radical Islam.
No. Against that
against
axis.
Globalism.
No. Against the axis of China, Persia, and Turkey.
I see.
Yes, the globalists are in the party of Davos is being destroyed right now.
Yeah.
The globalism is collapsing as we speak. It's two axes, and you're going to have the look. We'll be international, and that's an international system, but it'll be of individual nation states. Remember, only thing you can get value in sovereignty. It's the whole Christian concept of subsidiarity, pushed down right to the lowest thing. That's what the nation state. The Treaty of Westphalia. The nation state is so powerful. This is my guy.
Okay. Haven't heard his voice for a while. Yeah.
So that's. I guess this is obviously a very topical example. We've kind of joked around before. Thank you so much, Why, for this super chat. Kind of joked around before about how I get the feeling that a lot of right wingers in the last few weeks, it's like that meme with the guy who's sweating while there's the two buttons in front of him. It's like one of them is like, because they're like all like hyper patriots. So one of them is like, oh, war, kill all the Russians, and the other one is like, yeah, but Putin is kind of doing all the stuff that we like. Like this seems like our kind of guy.
Right. Yeah, it's such a shame. I would love to speak to him more now. He for as much as everybody watches his podcast, which has become, I think, a legitimately influential force in part of the Republican world. He doesn't say a lot about his own thoughts there. He's mostly interviewing people, and he'll kind of nudge them around. But when I was having conversations with him, he met in November 2018. This was one of the big reveals of the book. He met with Alexander Dugin, who also, like Bannon, as I said, has a long history of celebrating traditionalism. Tried to name a school after René Guénon, one of the early thinkers. And Dugin he's not Putin's brain, as some people say, but he is a deceptively influential philosopher, political operative in Russia. And Bannon met with him in Rome. The whole purpose of their meeting was to try and bring the United States and Russia together on the basis not of secular political values, not on the basis of economics or anything that might seem more familiar to the political world, but on the basis of this deep essence that we are both Christian and we both believe in nationalism. And by the way, our union might, as he started to talk about there with the Westphalia thing, our union might bring about a world that is fractured in a good way, that is shattered into small pieces. And because if you think back to what I was talking about with the time cycles, a world of difference, a world of small bounded entities is a golden world, or a world more golden at least. And these were the types of pitches that they made to each other. The force against it in Alexander Dugin's eyes has always been the United States. He's always thought that, okay, United States is this, we have this universal ideology of liberal democracy, human rights, capitalism. We're the ones destroying borders. Bannon was trying to make a case to Dugin and say, no, China is the one who's destroying the borders. They're the actual engine of globalization. They have some upper crust in the United States that works with them, but they're not. But that's actually where it is. And you, by the way, Dugin, need to pull Russia out of the sphere of China and toward the United States. So that's what they were trying to do. That was the context for the clip.
Yeah, so I guess Dugin seems like my impression of him, at least from what I've seen. I watched a debate that he did a couple years ago with Bernard Henri, and he seems like
Sorry.
What's that?
Yeah, Bernard Levy, who's walking around in Odessa, it seems, right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Honor Levy just sort of seems like vapid and annoying to me, but like Dugin is interested, and one of the most interesting things about him, besides the fact that he's just sort of like proudly anti-enlightenment, and like his defense to being called a fascist is I'm not a fascist because fascism is a phenomenon of the medieval world, of the modern world, right? And I still like the pre-modern world.
Start, but that's it.
Yeah, and but the other interesting thing about him is that he seems like one of the most like out of the closet examples of what our mutual friend Matt McManus calls a postmodern conservative, meaning that like he has this weirdly relativist way of defending ultra-conservative values, which is instead of saying like, oh, this is like God's plan for nature or something like that, he just sort of says, yeah, look, you can have your values. These are our Russian values. Everybody can have their own values.
Yes, and Matt's concepts are just wonderfully useful in this respect. But yeah, it's anti-imperialistic on the face of it, although recent events might qualify all that. But it's also about having a world of multiple truth regimes and opposing the epistemic colonialism and imperialism of the West as well. I mean, that's his affront to the Enlightenment. Its key sin is its universality, its claim to universality. But where do we end up with it? It sounded like you anticipate that. I mean, so Dugin wants this world of difference. We were talking about about having a bounded, stratified world, about that being an ideal. He wants that also to take place in the realm of knowledge and in domains of truth. And yeah, this came to a sort of sensational fore during the conflict in Syria, when people were confronting him about Russia's behavior in Syria and who they were supporting and so on and so forth. And he said, well, we have our special Russian truth about it. You may have your American truth about it. But that was his way of referring to it. It was interesting with me too. For a long time, he would not confirm the meeting he had with Bannon, even though I had enough information. I had not only him saying it to someone else, but I had Bannon's a really elaborate account of it. And he said to me, I will talk to you again, Ben, but only about ideas. Do not ask me about facts. And by the way, there's no such thing as facts, because the world is just our ideas. That was an email he sent to me. Say like, we can talk, but do not ask me if I was in Rome on this particular day speaking to this person. So yes, that's the direction. And he's much more interesting than Bernard Levy.
Yeah, no question. So, and that is really interesting. And I guess it's telling, like the way that you described that Bannon-Dugin meeting, because like obviously somebody like Bannon could recognize that Russia as its foreign policy as it exists now, as it existed then, right? Is something that is aligned in a different direction than what he wants as an American nationalist. But he sort of has this fantasy that you could that just sort of spiritual affinity could be enough to overcome that, and get them to, like, if he could show that they're that like that he and Trump are Dugin's kind of people enough, that that'll sort of be enough to sort of magically realign the geopolitics.
Yes, exactly. I mean, he thinks that a lot of the secular political world is just thin and will wash away. That it is our more archaic identities and allegiances that are going to resurface, and we're not actually seeing, well, progress. That this is just a parenthetical moment in time that will pass, and thus that would allow things to move back. I mean, the problem has always been, I mean, Masha Gessen is my really go-to source on this, but that Putin is not a Christian or a nationalist or anything. He's just kind of whatever he needs to be at any moment. He's tried on a great number of different ideological guises, and I think we're seeing that right now. This is not the behavior of a nationalist, right?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I guess it just seems like the behavior of somebody who's decided that the only way it's going to be taken seriously as a major player is to shoot the hostage, to show that he's willing to do that. Right? I mean, that which so like on some level it's incredibly irrational, but like on a but you could also sort of see at least maybe how he got there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, right. I mean, they're imperialistic. In my mind, imperialistic ambitions that are not observing some higher value of national sovereignty.
Oh, it just seems like it just. I mean, again, I think escalating the conflict to the point of invading the entire country is crazy. But like, I think up until then, it's just sort of pretty standard great power behavior in a neighborhood that was directed out of your sphere of influence. I mean, that's not at all mysterious or unusual, right? As far as television goes. I do want to make sure we get to it. You did send me one other piece of sound, right?
Yes.
Jake, do we have that one?
Yeah, but this is what Evelyn and these guys, they both admire, but you got to break out. That's why Athens in the Judeo-Christian West is the counter to this. It's always been the counter to this. In the very first day we took over in the White House.
Yeah.
And because Flynn and I wanted to make sure that when we relieved the watch at noon, we'd been working on the transition, but just like relieving the watch, we knew where all the fucking troops were. I want to make sure we knew exactly where everybody was deployed, because trust me, the apparatus, and I'm not a deep state guy, but it's got its own.
Yeah.
You can find out later, hey, there's 2,000 guys in Niger. There's 2,000 guys in and things like, hey, I don't remember that being in the pass down log, right?
Yeah.
So we went through everything, and in that moment, near Palmyra, there were in Syria.
It's okay. If you meant upstate.
Yeah, Palmyra in Syria.
Yeah.
There were 1,000 American Special Forces advisors with CIA paramilitary in the Syrian Free Army against then ISIS, with with Iranian Guard, Revolutionary Guard, and Hezbollah with the bad guys, literally 200 yards from where the Roman legions and the Persians were 2,500 years ago. In 2,500 years, it had not changed 100 fucking yards. It's called different names today, right? It's American Special Forces and Syrian Free Army and Hezbollah and Iran, but it's the same thing. It's 2,500 years. Shit does not change. This does not change.
There's something about watching that with the picture from the background, just the little sound waves over the screen, keeps making me think of the Colonel Kurtz clips in Apocalypse Now.
Oh, I'm too lame to know it. I'm afraid, but okay. I'll take it.
So that in the movie, they're before they send Martin Sheen off to assassinate Colonel Kurtz, they're playing these clips of him saying crazy things. So, in any case. So this is more of the cyclical time stuff that ties into that kind of right wing new agey traditionalist spirituality that you're talking about earlier.
Stasis. I mean the fact that really you can learn about the world today by reading Tacitus or something like that. Don't bother with anything new. For a period of time, he was wanting to produce a TV show called Those Who Knew, about it was all going to be about how the oldest ideas were the best ideas. where this comes in, I'm thinking about your earlier question, Ben, about how does he compare then? What does this actually mean, for him relative to other Republicans? One of the things that he does with that idea that we heard in that clip, is also to look past the content of what I think almost all Republicans probably build American nationalism with. He has said to me before, he looks at the Constitution, the Revolutionary War, all of those documents, all that nation forming stuff as being not the actual content of Americanism, as being part of a passing fad, an Enlightenment era preoccupation that, yes, it happened to be there when we became a nation, and therefore our national symbols are going to be devoted to it. But our actual Americanism is a revolutionary spirituality in his mind. It was the Puritans who came. It was the fact that the westward push. You had small towns that all had churches in them. That's what he thinks is actual America, in a sense. Is this hyper spirituality? That wouldn't offend. It's not an accident that he ends up in the Republican Party. But the fact that he would dismiss all of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, in his nationalism is one way also to start to draw some distinctions between himself and the others.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess one way I was thinking about this, right? So this question about, is somebody like Steve Bannon basically just like a regular Republican? Is he something that's fundamentally different? And I wonder if there's a way that both of those could sort of be right, or that something in between them could be right, because I guess the analogy I was just thinking about is if you think about like DSA, not DSA now, when it's got like 100,000 members, and people who are like very high profilely associated with it or whatever, like DSA in like the 80s, or the 90s, when it's this very small organization, but you do, surprisingly, if you start to look into this, you get people who are Democratic office holders who don't seem like they're crazily radical, who had DSA membership cards in their pockets. And you think, like, what's going on there, right? Like, and if you think, actually, let's put it this way: you think about one of those guys, right? You're like Dinkins or whoever, and like somehow you're a DSA member, and were those guys regular Democrats? Well, yes and no, right? I mean, like they clearly had like sort of long-term horizons, or at least they sort of dreamed, very privately dreamed dreams that went like well beyond regular Democratic Party politics. But given the time and place they were in, like in practice, they were basically just regular Democrats who just did regular Democrat things, right? So it's like, so I guess maybe the kind of final question here is like, is somebody like Bannon, who has these sort of like, fascist light intellectual interests and, a sense of spirituality and all that stuff, right? Like, is he sort of the traditionalist version of, like the sort of right-wing mirror image version of one of those Democrats? Or is there a way that you think, within the constraints of American politics as it exists right now, there's actually an opening for people with his views to get things done that are worse than what any Republican would want to do?
I want to say yes to both of those things. I think it's a fantastic analogy, because it's not an accident that I think that he ends up in the Republican Party in general, and then associated with these anti-establishment nationalist populist movements, if we're going to grant me the ability to use the word populist here, because let's say the libertarian opposition to Washington, the call for states' rights, the belief that government has gotten too big and needs to be drawn back. Those two principles are kind of bread and butter for American conservatism, and the traditionalist Bannon can work with them, and that's really good. It's kind of a question of what happens later down the road in their lifespan of those agendas, because small taxes, small government, states' rights, that's a good start for Bannon. what he would want to see is the modern institutions to be completely gutted, to see a complete, a complete falling apart of, let's say, the media, the university world, all these governmental agencies that was something he did early in the Trump administration, was appointing people. He was contributing to, Betsy DeVos and Mulvaney and all of those initial appointments. He wants to see them brought down to the ground. But after that, after this period of destruction, for the libertarian, it's not let's destroy everything. It's the dark age. But for Bannon, it is. After that period of destruction, he would want to see a new statism. He would absolutely want to see in the place of these institutions some new, better state power arise that might not necessarily be an empire and something that would be homogenizing and would force a bunch of other states to fold into itself, but it would still be a new state power, a theocratic state power, probably something that had spirituality as its primary target, whatever that would mean in practice, right? So it's in those later stages, but to begin with, yeah, and I imagine, I haven't talked to the DSA, of course, so much better than I do, but I imagine that there's a similar understanding to a similar relationship to the Democratic Party, that, well, this is a useful vehicle for now, and we can ride it as long as we can, and if political circumstance changes, then perhaps a departure would be in order. But I think that's how Bannon looks at the Republican Party too. He has no particular allegiance to it or love for it.
Got it. All right. Well, this was really interesting. Thank you so much, Benjamin.
It's awesome to be with you, Ben.
All right. It's Benjamin Teitelbaum, author of The War for Eternity. People should check that out. Should also check out his appearance on Plastic Pills. Thank you, Benjamin. We are going to start the philosophy segment with Jen in just a minute. But before we do that, because we were talking about Bannon, and because what I said earlier about the Red Scare interview, I sort of realized was directly taken from something that Michael Brooks said at the time. So I thought we could just play that clip if we have it. Do we have it?
Are you guys going to listen to the Red Scare interview with Bannon?
I listened to half of it. Boring. I mean, honestly, the thing I would say is I think that they actually did a totally fine job of showing that he's pretty boring. I don't know if that's how they would interpret what they did. It doesn't matter to me. I think that, again, this is another thing. This guy is a mass figure. Mm-hmm. In his case, he's not a neutral figure. That's someone who does need to be confronted and competed against aggressively. But the idea, this isn't somebody who's got 3 Twitter followers and writes stupid blog posts and they're going to get amplified. This is somebody who helped elect somebody president of the United States. I definitely heard a big takeaway I had was, okay, you talk all this populist stuff. Why don't you support single payer? And basically he just ended up basically sounding like a Democrat, which is kind of funny with all of his prevaricating and bullshit.
All right. Which was kind of that was very much on my mind during that interview, which is not to say that that the other Benjamin Teitelbaum didn't move me a little bit closer to his perspective, which he did, hence the DSA analogy at the end. But now, hello, Shabazz. I am joined by the
not the other, by the Dr. Burgis.
What am I?
Yeah. So
if you're the Dr. Burgis, what am I?
You're the other.
Oh, I see.
That's what Silver told us the last time.
Yes, I do remember This is one of the Dr. Burgesses, Jennifer Burgess, philosophy professor, Georgia State. And she is here now for the philosophy segment this week. We are going to talk about a third Ben. Not
so many Bens.
I know, just lousy with Bens here. And this one is. Okay.
You know, Ben's mom is a Dr. Burgess also.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
yeah.
There's also my mom is a is a retired math professor. So yeah, that is, you know, none of us are the kind of doctor who could actually help people who are sick. But
nope.
in any case, so I have so we're going to watch this third Ben, by far the you know, in however you want to rank the Bens. You know, I've got to say, not at the top of my list. But you know, I suppose
you're at the top of my list of Bens.
So in any case, we have a clip of Ben Shapiro talking a little philosophy. Do we? I thought we did. All right. Well, let's do the let's just banter for a minute. You know, we'll see if we have that. Yeah. Here we go. Here it is.
Hi. How's it going? So yeah, I was a socialist in 8th grade, actually, until I got cognitive dissonance watching your Piers Morgan interview. Mm-hmm. But since then, I'm a senior now in high school, and I founded the YAF chapter. And
good for you. That's great.
So yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could get a photo for publicity.
You'll watch this, and we'll get it back.
Like I say, we'll try and get some photos afterward.
But so yeah, when you're arguing with atheists, in the end of the argument of morality, there's almost always a concession that there's no objective right or wrong. As a Christian or a religious person, how can we prove that there's an objective morality without explicitly citing religion?
So there's two basic approaches to morality, both of which rely on an unmoved mover. One is the more secular Greek approach, and one is the Judeo-Christian approach. The Judeo-Christian approach is revelation, right? Either in the Judaic version, God came down on a mountaintop and informed people what was good and what was right and what was wrong, and what we should do and what we should not. And in the Christian version, Jesus came to earth and gave a moral code. So there's revelation, and then there's the Greek teleology, which essentially suggests that there's an unmoved mover that caused the universe to be the way that it is, and in the very nature of the universe itself, you can discover rules for living. So this is the difference between the Aristotelian good, for example, and what you would consider just moral good. So you might say that something happens and that's bad or that's good. What Aristotle would say is it's not that something happens and it's bad or good, it's fit or unfit, meaning that certain things are created for certain purposes. So for example, what makes a shovel good is its capacity to dig, right? So a good shovel, the way he uses good is this way. A good shovel is a shovel that you can dig with. A good man is a man who can reason, right? Because what man is uniquely created to do is reason. What human beings, or people, as Justin Trudeau would say, are capable of doing is reasoning. And so the more you use your reason, that is what you were put on earth to do.
Okay. I'm not sure. So Justin Trudeau is the only person who says people? That was very confusing to me. But
I assumed I was missing some joke.
Maybe it's a callback to something earlier in this event, but it's just kind of weird. It's like, man, people, if you're Justin Trudeau, it's the only person in the world who would say that. But anyway, that was just weird. But sorry, let's so good shovel is for digging, a good man is for reasoning. Let's pick it up from there.
And then you can derive a certain set of rules. People were meant to do justice based on the nature of who people are. People were meant to get married and have babies based on the nature of what sex is. Right? So you can derive some rules from that. Now, that was basically, I would say, torn apart by a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, ranging from David Hume to Voltaire to Spinoza. But I don't know that they sufficiently reject that argument, because then they go find a moral system on their own. Either they find an arbitrary moral system, or they try to reconstruct a moral system based on premises that are not available in nature. Right? They try to set up universal principles like Kant tries to do, but that's a universal principle Kant came up with, so it's inherently subjective. So if you want an objective morality, you either have to go to the nature of things and try to derive from the nature of things what you ought to do. You have to connect to is and ought in a way that David Hume would not like, or you have to go to Revelation and say, here is what God actually said to human beings and instructed them to do. Now, the good news is that the vast majority of things that the Greeks thought were good are also the same things that are thought good in Judeo-Christian systems of thought, which is what Aquinas says, what Maimonides says, it's what Augustine says, even though he's attempting to draw some distinctions. Christianity, historically speaking, was maybe the first attempt to actually meld the thought of Judaic thought with Greek thought, which is why the New Testament is written in Greek as opposed to being written in Aramaic or Hebrew, which was the parlance of the time. So all of that is a very long way and a historical way to say that no one has yet come up with a system of morality that is objectively verifiable and that actually gives us all the things we want outside of the history that I just gave to you. So this is what I said to Sam Harris. So Sam Harris comes to a lot of the same moral conclusions that I do, right? That we have individual rights and that we as individual human beings shouldn't hurt each other and that we have the right to free speech and that we have the right to property. And what I said to him is there's an entire 3,000 year history to get us to those rights, right? Born out of Judeo-Christian and Greek thought. And you're just taking the cherry off the top and proclaiming that this is obvious to everyone. And clearly that's not the case, because for the vast majority of people on Earth for all of human time, that is not true. And this has been our main disagreement. And again, I think that it's very difficult for Sam or for atheists generally to get to a moral system that is not arbitrary. It may be a system that I agree with. They may have morality that I agree with, but it's hard for them to say this is objectively true on any level without some appeal to either the nature of things or some appeal to God himself.
All right.
What?
So what I got out of that,
Where to begin?
is that the only way you can believe in objective morality is in one way or another from either from religious revelation or from believing that you can tell what's morally right and wrong from looking at the natural purposes of things, and that everything else is subjective. So Immanuel, see, you're too late. You should have done this earlier. So Immanuel Kant, with the categorical imperative, that's just subjective because he's not getting it from looking at the natural purposes of things.
What?
I mean, it's more your territory than mine. You're the ethicist.
I see. The whole problem with this is that Kant was very into reason, which is where he got his moral system from, which is what Aristotle said was the purpose of man. So it does seem to be coming from the natural order of things.
Yeah, and it's weird too because it seems a little unclear. Like when he gives that whole Aristotelian build-up, and by the way, I don't know what it is with all these guys. They all love the phrase "the unmoved mover." Remember, Charlie Kirk did that too in our debate.
None of that has anything to do with the unmoved mover.
No, none of it does. But somehow that's like a deep-sounding phrase they've all latched onto. So when they're talking like philosophy and they're referring to God, they say, "Or the unmoved mover." Even when it's a sentence that has absolutely nothing to do with what Aristotle was talking about when he used that phrase.
I see you over there, Cameron, by the way. See you.
So
where is Silver? Is Silver not here?
Oh no, Silver popped up earlier.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. Here's a Silver chat.
Oh, okay.
Could just say I'm joined by Dr. Burgess and trust the audience to not think you're saying you'll be joined by yourself. Silver's really hung up on this Dr. Burgess thing.
As is correct.
But, yeah, it's so putting aside that weird little pretentious flex about the unmoved mover, it seems like, why is it that there's all the stuff about nature and the natural purposes of things, and not that shovels are part of nature, but whatever. The natural purpose of a shovel is to dig, and whatever. Like, what's the point of all that if the end of it? Oh, no.
Shabazz is barfing.
Okay, that was very unfortunate timing.
Yeah.
Poor kitty. So it just seems like if the if all of that stuff is going to be building up to the natural purpose of man is reason, and then we're going to use reason to figure out morality, why don't we just come in at that, right? I mean, like, what's the point of all the natural purposes stuff? I don't really get that, unless maybe the point is that the reason why what your reason tells you is morally right is because that's how God intended you to figure out morality, and so it's only objective morality if you realize that has something to do with God or the unmoved mover.
The thing is, he talks so fast, and I'm not trying to make fun of him for talking fast, but the faster somebody talks, the less easy it is to follow them. And I think sometimes he feels like if he just throws out some, cool sounding things, then at the end you'll be like, yeah, unmoved mover, Aristotle. Because it is difficult to like follow each step as a step. So if you just remember that he said unmoved mover somewhere in there, then that sounds good.
Yeah. No, I think that is probably the right diagnosis of what's going on there. We could just end the segment there, but I will say one more thing, and which is, okay, what are we supposed to be getting out of this, of all this stuff about natural purposes? And like, what is it that's supposed to be better about that than like the categorical imperative? And it seems like either we're just supposed to be comparing these two things.
Well, what I think he thinks is better about it is it's not arbitrary.
Right, but why is that less? How is it less arbitrary?
I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Because nature is nature, and Kant just decided on reason. But nature, that's nature.
I mean, okay, but that's reason. Aristotle just decided on nature. Like, we can play this game in both directions. I don't really see what we're getting out of this.
Because reason is a part of things. Nature is like everything.
Okay, this sounds like that Jordan Peterson thing about how you can't have a science of climate because climate is everything. Yeah.
Like Kant has picked something out of something that's all encompassing, and he's just decided to.
Okay, but why is it that like things being used according to their purposes, isn't that something we're just picking out?
No, Aristotle says that's the function of things, like what things are.
Okay, but
dude, we have all forgotten what the original question was.
Yeah, the original question was how you argue with atheists because they don't believe in objective right or wrong. You think Ben Shapiro, with his deep knowledge of Greek philosophy showed off here, would perhaps direct the questioner to the Euthyphro dilemma.
We know where that goes. And the problem is that the Euthyphro dilemma had not yet been answered at this time.
Okay. This is before Charlie Kirk
exactly
came up with the definitive answer.
Exactly.
Just both. So, pre-Kirk, we used to think the Euthyphro dilemma showed that these are actually separate subjects, God or no God, and objective morality, no objective morality. But then Shapiro's response is all this stuff, all of this galloping talk about all this galloping talk about natural purposes and shovels and and all that stuff. And again, if we're just comparing these as theories of morality, see which is more innately plausible, it's not at all obvious why that one wins. I mean, example I used to use back in the old days, in like teaching classes at like Miami-Dade College in the late 2000s.
Man, you're old.
Yes. I mean, I was still in grad school, but yes, I still makes me old. And this is back when gay rights were much more controversial. Gay marriage was like a big hot button issue, and so sometimes students would like bring up like arguments from nature against it. That it's that the gayness is unnatural, and I would point out it's like, okay, well, hold on, if you really just want to do the Aristotelian, they talk about the natural purposes of things. Like, what's the natural purpose of a tree? Like, you could sit under it, it'll give you some shade, squirrels can live in it. Here is something that's not a part of the natural purpose of a tree. Having,
Nice. Good job.
Slicing it up into thin pieces and scattering ink over it to communicate information. That's not part of the natural purpose of a tree.
I'm sorry, what book was that you were using as an example?
Oh, this is Logic Without Gaps or Gluts.
Who wrote that?
Looks like Benjamin Allen Burgis wrote this.
Oh, is that another Dr. Burgess?
No, it's one of the ones on screen. So this really was just the closest book that was on hand. Although we should.
It wasn't really. There was one right there.
Yeah.
It was easier to get to, but hey.
Yeah. Well, this is okay. We'll do this one. So this is A Terrible Country, which is a novel by Keith Gesson, who I believe is he might actually be the brother of Masha Gesson, who's referred to earlier in the episode. I guess I was reaching for this because this was the closest philosophy book. So okay, shade, squirrel dwelling, any of these things you could say are part of the natural purpose of a tree. Birds can make nests in the branches, right? Definitely not part of the natural purpose of a tree is to turn it into a book. So are books morally wrong because they violate the natural? It's an unnatural way of using the tree.
This is why you need an e-reader.
Because e-readers appear in nature.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, you learn something new every day. I am constantly, the last few months, I've been constantly learning new things about philosophy. The right answer to the youth throw dilemma is both. E-readers are more Aristotelianishly moral than books because they don't violate the natural purpose of trees. So good stuff. We actually should do. I was just kind of reaching for it because I was in the middle of making the example and I saw I was there. But we actually should do a philosophy segment about this at some point.
Wait, does he have to read it?
Yep. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Have fun with that. No, it's yeah. I should say, actually, I've not really been pushing this because academic publishing being what it is, and it's not cheap, but if you're interested in this, get your library to get for you. But in any case, I think Ben Shapiro continues to not be very convincing to me, even though he does talk fast and he does sound very sure of himself. Now, that said, I was recently told by one Joseph Rogan that when I said, if Ben Shapiro wanted to come on my show to argue with me about stuff like this, I'd be happy to have him. And Joseph told me that I'm sure he'd do it. Or he'd probably do it. He'd probably do it. So, Ben Shapiro, if you're watching, and I assume you are,
of course,
got to prove Joseph right about this. So we got to make this happen. Meanwhile, though, I am going to go to the post game for patrons. If you are not a patron yet, patreon.com/Ben Burgis. You get these patron exclusive post games after every episode, various other benefits. We might be introducing something that Jen does once a month. A couple people were suggesting that. So
I don't know if anybody's interested, so we'll have to see if people are interested in that.
Some people do seem to. In any case, we got to go to the post game for patrons. We're going to watch the Q&A from that debate. Apparently, Haas, or as he prefers to as he prefers to be known, the Kremlin Gremlin gets very upset in the Q&A. So I don't know how much could be learned from it, but it does sound like a fun post game activity. So we're going to go do that right now. If you are already a patron, you should have the link for that already. And if you're not, there's no time like the present. So I will. Meanwhile, we'll be doing next Monday for the main event. We're going to be unlocking an interview the patrons have already seen, but nobody else has. They got it a few months ago, which is my interview with Gregory Sadler about Stoicism and teaching philosophy in prison and a bunch of other things like that. Should be really good stuff. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, we're not doing it on Thursday. Not going to try to counter-program St. Patrick's Day bar hopping, but normally these are on Thursdays. But on Wednesday this week, Nathan J. Robinson is going to be joining me. We're going to watch the Christopher Hitchens, William F. Buckley debate. So should be fun stuff. We'll see everybody on Wednesday.
Team Snoopy forever.
Left is best.